At Coveros, we recognize that learning is a journey, not a destination. A trusted resource for organizations of all sizes, our companies have trained more than 30,000 software professionals, helping them on the road to what is next. With our live virtual learning platform, you and your team attend professional training courses right from your computer. Easy and quick access fits today's working style and eliminates expensive travel and long days away from current projects. We have a variety of tools built into the learning platform to engage learners through dynamic delivery and to facilitate a multi-directional flow of information. Our engineers and expert instructors share their real-world experience along with practical exercises to deliver an interactive online learning experience. Participants communicate in real time with the instructor, asking questions, providing comments, and engaging in class discussions. Access our most requested courses in topics like Agile, DevOps and cloud skills, software testing and test automation, internationally recognized certifications, and more. With a private live virtual class, your team gains flexibility in scheduling and class length. Course customizations and follow-on coaching can also be added, creating a learning experience that immediately applies new skills in existing projects. At Coveros, we deliver quality training and hands-on coaching that meets your budget, program schedules, and business goals. Visit us at coveros.com today to learn more.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexa, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for Lessons Learned Designing Tests for CI/CD with Melissa Benua and Jeff Payne.
Welcome, everybody, to Lessons Learned Designing Tests for CI/CD. My name is Jeffery Payne. I'm the CEO and founder of Coveros. I've been building and testing software for way too long, maybe 3 decades, something like that, and have run a couple of software companies focused on Agile and DevOps and the integration of test and security into those things. I'm also the technical editor of Agile Connection. Really happy today to introduce my co-host for this webinar, Melissa Benua. I'll let you introduce yourself, Melissa. Welcome to the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I am a director of engineering with a startup called mParticle, which is a massively scaled data platform. If you have an app on your phone, you probably have mParticle on your phone too. But I've been doing this for more than 15 years now. I started continuous delivery, continuous testing, continuous everything when I was at Bing, which is bigger scale than most people think it is. But while I was there, our team oversaw releases that were probably looked really familiar to people, took 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how bad integration went. Took a really long time, difficult time, and turned into a product that shipped code from thousands of developers every day, multiple times a day, no problem, no issue, nothing like that. And so ever since then, I've been sort of spreading the love to other companies. So I did something similar at a really small startup called PlayFab. We had 6 or 7 engineers, and we functioned like 30. And now the same thing at mParticle, which is a little more mid-sized, transforming from a relatively slow release process, something that's much faster and much more reliable. So this is my passion and my bread and butter.
That's awesome, Melissa. Welcome, and looking forward to chatting with you about this. We've talked a couple of times in the last couple of months about this topic. It's obviously something you're very passionate about, so I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about it and also talking to the participants here as well. So let's jump right into it. We've told you a little bit about us. We want to find out just a little bit about you and who's in the audience. So I'm going to open a poll. If you could just put in your role. If you don't see something that matches up with your role, select other and just put in the chat what your role is. Try to think of some common roles, but obviously we can't cover every. Just to get an idea of who's in the audience here today. No great surprise, Melissa, right? I mean, this is a webinar on, test and automated test and integrated into DevOps. And almost 60% of the people here are from test, right?
Yep, which is
Doesn't
a nice
surprise
spread.
you, does it?
Some people from just about everything, which is nice.
It is nice. I see no one from security, though. That concerns me, quite honestly, since I used to run an AppSec company. We'll talk about security later, but that worries me a little bit, right? It's kind of important to integrate security testing into the DevOps properly, right?
It is. It is. There's absolutely a time and a place where you have to have it.
Absolutely. Yeah. But overall, as expected, a lot of people focused on tests, which is great. So what we're going to cover today in this webinar is we're really going to focus on three key aspects of designing tests as they relate to CI and CD. We're going to go through, why we should decide and focus on tests that are most important, why we obviously want those tests to be reliable, and why we want those tests to be specific. And Melissa's going to kick off each of these topics, talk a little bit about her perspective on that, and then I'm going to jump in and we're just going to jam on the topic for a bit. Please put your questions in the chat if you have any. We are leaving time at the end to answer your questions, and if there are additional questions that we don't get to, I, for one, are going to be, and Melissa, if she has time, we're going to jump over to the TechWall Hub, which is an online Slack community that we use a lot, and carry the conversation on over there for a bit as well. So definitely put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as many of those as we can. Let's talk about importance first, Melissa. Talk to me and talk to the audience a little bit about, how you figure out what's, most important and why importance is important. So we say when you're doing test design for CI/CD.
So I want to preface with that these principles are good whether you're in a continuous environment or not. It's just that they go from being nice and good to being critical when you're running a test hundreds to thousands of times a day, depending. So importance is first because you can't run everything all the time. Because when you're in a continuous delivery system, time becomes your most precious commodity. And you need to be able to know what failures you have as quickly as possible, and not continue to execute on something that you know is broken. Right, so that's what run the most important test first means. So in the context of, for example, integration testing, we'd want to run a smoke suite, which maybe takes 90 seconds, a minute, that just ensures that, my services are up, they can be tested, rather than trying to run your whole integration suite, which may take 15 or 20 minutes. Because if you haven't first checked that the services are up and available to be tested, testing any further scenarios is useless. They're of lesser priority, right? It's of course more important that your service stands up than it is that the pixels are all in the right place. So you want to make sure you're testing your highest impact and your fastest ROI first, so that you can abort any subsequent test runs, make changes. There's a lot of iteration in continuous delivery systems, so you want to cut your iteration times down as much as possible.
No, that's good stuff. One of the things I was thinking when you were talking there was, you mentioned, you're going to want to run things at certain times for certain reasons, and you have to have importance in the process because, you can't afford to run everything, right? How do you view, there's different stages usually in your CI/CD process, right? I mean, there's your continuous integration tests, which obviously you want to be very fast and kind of time boxed, right? I mean, you got to get feedback back to the development team quickly. And then you have maybe regression tests that run maybe as part of your continuous integration process, but definitely thereafter. And then you've got tests, non-functional and functional, that you're running for other reasons. You mentioned smoke. What do you think about how much does importance fit into all this when you're thinking about, and also time windows, right? Like how much time have you allocated or do you have during the process to do various types of testing? How does that factor into that?
So the way I usually break it up is across importance and time. And so your fastest and most important tests always come first. In our case, our fastest tests by several orders of magnitude, and I suspect this is true for most languages, are our unit tests. We run through 20 or 30,000 unit test cases in about 90 seconds. And so within that 90 seconds, we haven't really triaged the unit test based on what's more important and what isn't, because it's 90 seconds. Developers will wait 90 seconds for nearly anything. My rule of thumb is developers wait about 5 minutes for their initial results to come back. And initial results are usually at least compilation, preferably compilation and unit tests. So they'll wait about 5 minutes for first feedback. And then with an increasing order of complexity, they're willing to optionally wait longer depending on how important those tests are and how valuable the feedback is. My current system, because we have a continuous deployment system that deploys candidate changes, deploys the developer's candidate change pretty quickly into we call it a peer review environment. And so I found that our developers will wait about half an hour for that environment to be created, deployed, and then integration tested. And so because they'll wait about half an hour for the whole process, they really want to know. Within that, we've broken up to different milestones because half an hour is a long time. So creating the environment, standing it up, and then we return smoke tests very quickly. Obviously, the smoke tests don't usually tell them much about their feature, but they tell them, yes, we can integration test, or no, we cannot. So we've sort of broken, for tests that take more than 5 minutes, we break them up into sort of a two-tiered system. What is I cannot function without these tests as a service versus what are my, feature-based important tests, but maybe not necessarily the end of the world that, no other testing can continue with.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And I assume you find that in every environment, the windows are different, right? It almost depends on the team. Obviously depends on your application, and the tolerance for waiting probably depends on, the app and how long it takes to build and run and the environment and the market that you're in, right? So have you seen that vary quite a bit through the different companies you work with? What's been your thought there?
I find it's very language and tooling dependent. Right, I work a lot in .NET, and .NET is lightning fast for unit testing. Especially if your unit tests meet certain pretty strict guidelines like can't leave the box, can't do thread.sleep. As long as you maintain some pretty basic boundaries around what a unit test is and isn't, I find that they're very fast. Whereas some of our Node.js unit tests, they're slower. I'm not sure why they're slower, but the tooling, they're almost an order of magnitude slower. So people will wait longer for them. The expectation is that they're going to be slower. And likewise, even separate from languages, some of it depends on your historical context. I was talking to somebody who's got their integration test pass is 5 hours. And I said, okay, so that's your upper limit. You can't take more than 5 hours. Anything below that, you'll be hailed as a hero. But that's your line right now is 5 hours. So people are used to waiting 5 hours for results. Don't make it worse because then they'll get angry with you. Even though it's sort of an arbitrary number, it's just what they're conditioned to wait for.
Yeah, that's kind of the expectation. So, and we've seen some organizations are starting to obviously leverage the cloud to try to parallelize some of those tests in their process. So maybe depending upon how independent they are, obviously, and obviously your infrastructure and your environments, can you speed up that process? By parallelizing and getting more testing done faster. Are you seeing that as a trend, and how do you see that playing into, designing, how we build and design our tests and which ones are most important, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's the secret sauce in my 20,000 unit tests in 90 seconds is massive.
Yeah, parallelization. There you go.
We can just throw more cores at the problem and it goes away. Because machine time is so much cheaper than human time. Adding a couple cores costs me, $20 a month? I don't know of any human that costs me $20 a month.
Yeah, exactly. Nowhere in the world.
Nowhere in the world. So waiting for their test results. So I've made it actually a requirement in our unit test suites that they have to support parallelization. Even if that is in some cases marking that this specific part of the suite cannot, or marking, the correct concurrency expectations. The expectation has been set that these will be run in parallel. Deal with it and make sure your test cases support it. Integration tests get trickier, right? When you're starting to rely on external resources that may or may not be shared. I found it depends on when and how you start your automated testing in how your systems may support parallelized testing or not. Some architectures are better than others. For example, architectures that rely heavily on, say, static variables, right? Variables that are shared across all instances. Architectures that rely heavily on caching without any interfaces around it. Architectures that rely on meeting at the database but don't have a lot of protections around that. A lot of those can be very difficult to integration test in parallel because you'll find your tests colliding upon each other all the time. And so that may limit what you can do, certainly at the integration level. And that's okay, right? We work within the bounds that we have.
Yeah, and that's what I try to get folks to understand is, I mean, the whole CI/CD process, you're just bound by time in certain places. It might be expectation, as you mentioned, Melissa. It might be your ability to parallelize. It might be the kind of the expected feedback cycle and what works for your business. You just got to map that out and try to fit what you can in there. And you mentioned importance, right? And you note that you're not going to be able to necessarily cover every scenario. You're going to want to run the most important tests first. That's got to be your mentality, right? When you're basically trying to fit, all the testing you can into certain time windows. Is that a good way to look about it or think about it in terms of importance?
Yeah, you're trying to fit not just all the tests you can get, but all the value you can get into certain time windows. It's all about value. It's all cost benefit. Everything we do as developers, testers, whatever, is all in the end a cost benefit analysis. If I'm going to spend these 5 minutes, how can I make sure that these 5 minutes are worth my time? If I'm going to spend 4 hours, how can I make sure that 4 hours is worth my time? That there's not a better way to spend those 4 hours.
Yeah, and that's something it's off topic, so we don't have to get into it. But I know, developers are lazy. Even developers will brag about being lazy. I bristle at that personally, having been a developer, because I don't think I'm a lazy person. I just don't want to waste time, right? I want to figure out how to get done what I need to get done in the most efficient way possible. And that to me isn't being lazy, that's being smart, right? I don't know what you think about that, but what you're saying is exactly that, right? We're just trying to add value and get done what needs to get done in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think of it as lazy in the way that very similar to how Chris Loader puts lazy. He calls himself the lazy automator. It just means I want to be very efficient. I just want to be as efficient as possible. I don't want to have to write something if I can reuse something. I don't want to have to run tests that I know I'm not going to look at because I already know I'm changing the code. Want to be very efficient. And continuous delivery is all about efficiency.
I like that better than lazy. So last point before we move on to the next one is, you said understanding what failures can be tolerated. Can you talk about your perspective on, failures and what can be tolerated and what are the types of things that maybe you should consider tolerable, right, in your testing process in CI/CD?
Yeah, so that's something I talk about a lot when we go really, really in depth on this. But you're certainly in a continuous delivery environment, but really in every environment, right? You're not going to test everything. You don't have unlimited test time and unlimited test resources in order to test everything. So what I found that divide successful teams from unsuccessful teams is ones that acknowledge that there's things they're not testing. They're absolutely not testing, and they make a plan for that. You make a plan for knowing, I'm not testing this, but I have observability in place. I have monitoring to know if something has really gone off the rails. I have monitoring to know what to do, and I have a plan for how to deal with that. Whether that's rolling back a change, turning feature flagging to turn something on and off. Even if the plan is, we'll push a fix and have to roll forwards, and so sorry for the users. Like that's still a plan. Failing to make a plan is also a plan. Even if you fail to plan for the inevitable, it's still going to happen to you. You're still going to accidentally somehow ship a bad change, even if you thought you tested it, even if you thought everybody was really on point. It's going to happen. Something unexpected will happen. You will have downtime. It will impact your users. And the high-performing teams are the ones that know that and acknowledge that and make a plan to deal with it.
That's a good point. So let's move on to the second one so we stay on our plan, right?
Yes.
And that is about reliability. So give me your thoughts on the importance of reliability as a factor and kind of how do you look at reliability in your test design for CI/CD?
Yeah, so I look at reliability primarily as trust. The trust that we have in the automation to tell us the right thing. And if you don't have trust in the automation, you're both going to slow down your process and you're also leaving yourself vulnerable to shipping bugs in production. And I have a very, very specific story about this. At my last startup, we had a problem with caching and meeting in the database for integration tests, and we had one particular integration test suite that would happen all the time. We later found out it was because if you ran the integration test suite two at once in parallel, you'd get a bunch of failures because they were colliding. But we didn't know at the time why that it was flaky. We just knew it was flaky. So I was making a code change and prepping it to go out, and as usual, for the fourth time that day, the same old test suite had popped up, what looked to be a similar number of failures as usual. And I recall glancing at it and saying, "Oh yeah, something's funky with the character system in the database, but it's not really like it's just the test. The tests are super chatty. They're always putting those failures up, so it's fine." So I just ignored the failures because we were so used to seeing them, pushed anyway. But it turns out that in that specific case, it was actually returning about a different failure that was real. But our flaky test had so eroded confidence in that test suite that it was my own test suite that I just ignored. Like I glanced at it, seemed fine, ignored it, and pushed a real problem for production that caused a real outage and had to be rolled back and dealt with. And that's the worst of all situations. This one thing to ship a problem, that you didn't test, and whoops, I didn't test it, I didn't think of it. It's something else to ship a problem and you tested for it, and the test told you it was a problem, and you ignored the problem. That's just an incredible waste of time and resources. So being able to have trust in your automation, have a test that isn't flaky, that doesn't give you false negatives or false positives, that doesn't require you after every third run to go in and drop tables because it's leaving garbage all over the place. Having a test that you can trust is more important than I'd rather have a test that I could trust or have no test at all, as opposed to having an unreliable test. I'd rather be completely untested, because then at least I know it's not tested.
Yeah, and I like calling that trust. That's a great way to put it. Because when I was looking at this slide and looking at your comments on this slide, the thing that jumped out at me was that a lot of times these aspects of reliability are actually the reason why automation efforts fail, right? Whether it's CI/CD related or not, it's, people get frustrated when, their tests are flaky, they get different answers each time. They can't tell whether it passed or failed reliably, right? There's human intervention, there's maintenance issues. The tests aren't structured well to clean up, and you're left with stuff that impacts other tasks. I mean, all those are things that if you don't get right, your automation effort, whether you're doing CI/CD or not, is not going to be successful.
Exactly. And the bar is just so much higher in a continuous system. My team of 40 or 50 engineers pushes, I would say, 40 or 50 pull requests a day. Those generally have 2 or 3 iterations, before they get it right. So that's 150 test runs a day at a minimum of all of our test suites. So if we're running at 99% reliability for our test cases, that's 1 false failure a day, maybe 2.
Mm-hmm.
So I push to 99.9% reliability because I can tolerate, 1 false failure out of 1,000. But even then, right, that's 1 false failure every 10 days. And I'm not, we're not a particularly large team. Imagine that scaled down on a bigger team running those tests. How often are you going to deal with that unreliable? Like once every 10 days is pretty frequent. Be looking at, to be investigating, be wasting time investigating actual garbage.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you think that that the need for our tests, in particular in a CI/CD process, to be reliable has changed the way we think about where and how to automate? Do you see trends away from certain kinds of automation, or efforts in automating at a certain level to others? What's your sense of where automation is headed and going, when designing tests for CI/CD?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of push for reliability first. So, and I'm actually seeing it push not just into test design, but into architecture, right? Making architecture that is able to be reliably tested. I've seen it push into, decisions. I can see a clear difference in the services we designed before the integration test suite and the services we designed after the integration test suite. Because the ones designed after have hooks, they have just a much more testable architecture. They can be broken up into pieces, each of which can be tested independently and reliably.
Yeah, and that's a great point that I think a lot of organizations overlook is, a lot of times we still see in Agile and DevOps teams that design and development is off doing their thing, test is doing, their thing, and even though they're all in the same sprint and they may be pairing and working together, they might not be planning well together. And to your point, if you're not thinking about testability and some of those aspects as we design, architect, and design things, it's just going to mean overall less quality and less value to the customer, right?
Absolutely. I find that the best software architects don't necessarily need to be testers, but they should understand how testing is going to work on their system and work with, the test experts, whoever that may be, to ensure that testing is possible. There are some architectures that are fundamentally untestable. Maybe you can get away with some at the unit level, but I've seen architectures that you're like, how do I test this? That are very difficult, right? That are orders and orders of magnitude more difficult to test. For no reason other than it, seemed like a nice design pattern, and the architect ran with it because they didn't know it. They didn't have the testing expertise to understand how they were going to test it reliably in an automated way. You see that a lot in game design. I saw it a lot at small gaming startups where a lot of stuff was just throw it out there, get her done. Here's the pattern we've been using for the last N years. A lot of manual testing, which is fine, but it's not going to work. You can't have all manual testing behind your continuous delivery system. You can have manual testing, absolutely. You can't have all manual testing.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, it just gets harder and harder to, what I always say is like Agile or DevOps is kind of like, you're building software like a Russian doll where you're putting dolls, it's getting bigger every time you add functionality. And initially you might be able to test that manually and teams will try. But as the software grows, the amount of testing you need to do to not only test new functionality, but integrate it with old and regression tests to make sure you're not breaking other things, it just becomes intractable. And if you don't automate, then either your sprints just get really big because you keep making them longer to fit testing into them, or you break testing out, right? You've probably seen that. Or you just ignore testing, right? You just forget your definition of done and just declare victory, right?
Yeah, the further you push testing out of the development process, out of the sprint, the worse your quality is going to be. Because
and the longer your feedback's going to be, right? Yeah. So. One last question on this area. I got to zero in on the no false negatives or false positive statement you make, which I agree in principle, but I want your opinion about things like security testing, right? So I have a background in that security. There's certain kinds of security testing that inherently are going to give you false positives and false negatives. How do you deal with that in a CI/CD process? Are there ways to manage that, so to speak, or address that, because you're not going to have no false positives or negatives for things like security testing, for instance. Have you run into that?
Yeah, so we have a couple of situations. Security testing is one. Some UI automation is also that way, in that it returns to it's neither, and I like to be, it's neither false positive nor false negative, but indeterminate, right? It doesn't know. It's flagging something. This is important. You should look at this. The UI testing comes up usually as, this is a change. Did you mean this change? Is it a good change or a bad change? Security testing, we have our security suite pops the same way. It says, just so you know, there might be a problem here, but we're not, we don't have the full context to say so. And at that point, I move those. We certainly run those tests, but we run them last because they're going to take the most time. And at that point, they're functioning much more closely to a human reviewer than they are to an automated test. So they're sort of in this gray area of they're sort of automated manual testing. And so they can exist. They just have to be run at the end when all the reliable automated tests have completed and given you their go, no go. Because those take several orders of magnitude more time. It comes back down to time. Because a human has to read and interpret and investigate. So rather than giving you a result in 100 microseconds or 100 milliseconds or even 10 seconds, right, your result's going to be 10 minutes, 10 minutes if a human has to read and understand and grok. So because it's, again, so much slower, it gets bumped way out to the end.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And do you do the same thing with UI tests? like, as you mentioned, sometimes it's really hard. And so it's just timing, right? You might not know about delays or whatnot, particularly if you've got a distributed system. What do you do with those kind of UI-based tests where the amount of time it takes to get responses vary, and sometimes that means your test says it failed when it really didn't.
Mhm.
Do you move those to the end too? What do you do with those kinds of things? Same
So it
thing?
depends on the UI test. I've absolutely seen UI testing done at the unit level, right? Your JavaScript UI functions can absolutely be unit tested. Those are super fast, super reliable. They can run
Yep.
first, no problem. I've seen UI testing, especially UI testing using a tool called Cypress. Uses a lot of mocks, uses a lot of data encapsulation. Those can run really fast. I run those in integration tests. And by really fast, I usually mean couple milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, because sometimes the browsers are slow. It still runs through the browser, but they're super reliable because they're not hitting any external resources. So they can run, again, they run after the unit test, they run at the integration, the integration level, no problem. And then there's the category of tests that, to your point, have timeouts, can be unreliable because sometimes you're on one side of the timeout, sometimes you're on the other. Sometimes they're doing visual diff. Visual diff is notorious for being needing some human interpretation upon it. And those run at the end. They run in the last final, last gasp check when the human reviewers may run. Because the other point I don't think I brought up before is I don't have human reviewers look until the machines have looked. Because to my point about human time versus machine time, why would I waste a human's time on a change I know has to be updated because it failed a unit test? Right? You're just wasting someone's time. So I don't ever advocate for having a human look until all the reliable, fast automation is completed. And then the sort of specialty set of unreliable tests, security passes, UI passes, I run as if they were another human.
That's a good point. I like that. So the third one that we want to talk about is specificity, right? So talk a little bit about specificity for your tests, how you think about that and integrate that into your test design process.
Yeah, so specificity is about how we build in testing importance and how we build in testing reliability. So if you have a test case, and maybe this will sound familiar to someone, but let's say we've got one test case, and the test case says, all right, it's about validating that a user on your website can add something to the cart. And if your test case goes like this, I have to create the user, and then the user has to log in, and then the user has to browse to the commerce page, and then the user has to find the item number 3, and then the user has to add them to the cart, and then the user clicks on the cart, and then I see that the thing is there. You're testing a ton of different systems with one test case. And it may be true that all of those things do have to work in order to test adding to the cart. But just one test case is going to pop failures all the time for all kinds of different stuff, and that test case is probably going to be pretty slow, probably going to be pretty unreliable at answering the question of, can I add things to the cart? Right? Because when you're looking at your test case and you're reading a failure, you want to know exactly what failed. So you wouldn't think that a test case called adding something to the cart is failing because registration isn't working. That greatly increases the amount of time it takes a human to investigate an actual test failure. Probably also increases the amount of time it takes for the test to run in general. So in that case, right, there's really at least 2 and probably 3 different tests that test cases that should have been in that one. Right? There should be a registration suite, which may or may not be combined with login, depending on how tightly entwined those systems are. There's probably a suite for navigation, making sure the main pages of your site load and render correctly. And then there's probably then your test cases for dealing with the cart, interactions with the cart, your commerce suite. Depending on the size and scope of your systems, there may be more, there may be less. But that way you can say in the test pass, the registration suite isn't working. So I actually don't need to run any of the other tests because it's pointless. They're all nothing's going to work because I know registration isn't working. Because you may be able to say, you know what, no integration tests at all can run if registration doesn't work, and that's okay to say. And now you've just prioritized your test cases as well. So by making your test cases very specific, you've unlocked the ability to set priority and run important test cases first.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And do you then think to take that to the next level? I mean, obviously, you do eventually want to test your kind of workflow, your use cases, your kind of maybe you call it end-to-end integration or whatever you call it. In your strategy, do you try to take the tests that you've created for specific purposes and string them together to do end-to-end types of test activities? Or do you create end-to-end tests for those that you do think are important to do? How do you strategically structure your test, kind of your test suite? If that makes
So it
sense.
sort of depends on what your goals for testing are. For my purposes, when I think about in a unit testing, right, I'm testing the functionality of my individual pieces. So I unit test everything to death because I'm looking for, incorrect functionality. I passed it in a 10 and I got back a 3, but I should have gotten back an 8. That sort of level of, I gave it the string foo, I should have gotten the string bar, I got string X. That sort of functionality should be covered at the unit level, right? That's perfect, it's fast, it's exactly the sort of tests that are unit tests. Whereas at the integration level, I'm primarily concerned with how do these things play nicely with each other, right? So can service A talk to service B? Have I made, there's all kinds of things you can do at the integration level, whether that's contract testing, interface testing, API testing. But you shouldn't be exploring functional behavior at that point. You're exploring interface level behavior. Can these things talk to each other? If thing 1 returns an error, does thing 2 behave correctly? And so those may be scenario based, but they're not scenario based in exploring the full range of inputs from function A into from thing A to thing B. You're exploring the classes of inputs, right? If thing A has a null input, what happens when it gets down to thing B? And so I extend that out to eventually hit the end-to-end scale. Of can all my things speak to each other such that if they're all working correctly for a couple sentinel cases, they can speak correctly. Are they handling valid inputs in a way I would expect and invalid, certain classes of invalid inputs in the way we would expect? So you may have, let's say, 1,000 cases at the unit level of exploring functional functional test matrix. You may have, 10 to 100 at the integration level exploring communication across the various input and output classes. And you may have, 1 to 10 truly hitting end-to-end, depending on how many services you have, saying, yep, the inputs are across all the services seem to make sense.
Yep, you and I think exactly the same, Melissa. So unfortunately, we can't fight about this, right? So what's it's a webinar that we don't disagree, but you're getting to the the concept of call it the agile testing pyramid, call it a testing pyramid, call it whatever you want. This idea that we should be building up confidence right from the ground. Mm-hmm. Right, you build up from where you start, and you don't have to. You mentioned minimizing overlap, right? One of the things we often see organizations do, and then they wonder why their testing's not efficient, is they're effectively redoing testing at end-to-end levels that they really did already at lower levels. They just don't have a way to know that, or that they haven't strategically thought it through like that and minimize the redundancies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a killer for test organizations in terms of adding value and productivity. And to your point in CI/CD, that just isn't going to work at all, right?
Exactly. Having coverage analysis or impact analysis is huge, especially if you're, have an older product, 10 or 15 years old, it's been accumulating tests across those 10 or 15 years. Your test runs maybe 4 or 6 or 12 hours. I wouldn't start with anything except analyzing your impact and your coverage of your suites, because you may find a ton of overlap, right? Especially branch coverage, and that's a really easy, low cost way to start slashing those tests out, reducing your maintenance load, and increasing your runtime without really any loss, right? Because everything it's testing is covered by something else.
Yeah, and you mentioned code coverage there for a second, just to tease that apart. So talk a little bit about exit criteria, acceptance criteria, definition of done, right, and how you measure that, control that in a CI/CD process, right? Because that's really if you call it the gate or whatever, that determines whether at a particular part or particular stage in your process, you've done what you've decided is acceptable, agreeable amount of testing, right? How do you look at those things?
So I use, especially at the unit level, I use coverage as a simple bar. And I don't actually set very high coverage numbers because I mostly want to know, did you test it or not? I'm mostly interested in the binary question as opposed to, did you test 83% of your code or not? If I have to set something specific, I'll usually set around 50. 50 being the bar, the minimum bar. Like you have to do at least 50. I've seen less because, especially if your legacy coverage is very low, right? If your existing test coverage, unit test coverage is at 20 or 30%, it's not realistic to set 50 as an expectation because, your organization just may not be able to write that many tests to cover every single change. They need to function still. So setting the metrics so that you're not making it worse, right? You don't want to make the problem any worse. So if you generally have 20 or 30% code coverage, then set your bar at 20 or 30%. So you're not making it worse. You're probably making it better, but at least you're not increasing your debt. I always set, you have to have all your tests passed. I don't allow overrides for, well, this failure doesn't apply to me because whatever, because either fix it or turn it off. Because you're gonna break the database in production. Don't do it. It's a trap. And those are automated checks, right? You have to be careful with automated checks because there's always people who think they have an exception, sometimes legitimately so, or they have a good reason why this can't be so, or I don't need this check because whatever. And as soon as people start trying to find ways around your checks, they've spent more time trying to do the bad thing than just doing the right thing. So I very much try not to set up a situation where people are going to spend energy trying to get around an automated check.
Yep, no, that's good advice.
They absolutely will. If you give them enough reason to, they will spend time trying to get around.
Oh yeah, we've had teams just turn various types of testing off, and it wasn't malicious. It was done, as a short term. I need to get something somewhere somehow, and then just they forgot to turn it back on or whatever. It just didn't ever get re-enabled, and everybody blindly going forward thinking that, wow, boy, we're getting great results. Nothing's ever failing. And they weren't actually checking anything.
A team of developers that realized, because the automated checks were taking at one point like 35 or 40 minutes, they realized that, they often case would happen. They had one small little nitpicky PR feedback. Hey, you need, you increase your indentation on this line, or you need brackets, something dumb like that. So they figured out that if they pushed the change up and landed it immediately, they could defeat the CI system, right? The CI system wouldn't create the new checks, and they could use the checks from the previous commit to land. Right? So they spent a lot of time and energy working around the system instead of just working within the system. It made it easier for them and more rewarding to work around it than just, because 45 minutes was too long for them to wait for a unit test pass. They weren't that was way too, and I agree with them, right? They shouldn't have to wait 45 minutes for adding brackets.
Yeah. Missing semicolon or something.
Yeah. They shouldn't have to wait 45 minutes for stupidity.
Yeah.
But
awesome. Well, we're going to shift here into Q&A. I see a lot of questions have rolled in, which is great. Before we do that, though, we do want to take a quick audience poll and talk a little bit about some upcoming things that you all might find useful. We want to find out kind of where you all are at in terms of these various areas of test design that have been mentioned. And so I'm going to turn on three questions for you all to answer real quick, just to give us some thoughts on where you're at in terms of considering test case importance, considering test case reliability, and considering test case specificity in your testing approach. Is that something right now you don't do at all? Do you always do it? Is it a sometimes thing? Kind of curious. We're curious, Melissa and I, where do you all stand in terms of
curious.
These very these aspects, right? And where people are at.
Really
It's still
interesting.
yeah,
Little.
so it looks like,
Yeah.
wow. So most organizations look at importance. It looks like, at least often, they consider importance.
Real
Um,
mixed bag about reliability.
Mixed bag, yeah. And that might depend on your market, right? I mean, one thing we see is that obviously the criticality of your software often dictates the reliability mindset, if you will, right? I'm sure you've seen that too. And
Mm-hmm.
so that could be that. And then it looks like specificity is the one that most people don't feel like they are considering as often as maybe the
Yeah.
other two. Although it's pretty close to
Close.
reliability,
Close
it
to
looks like.
reliability. I'm surprised about reliability, though I shouldn't be. Right? Whenever I say if you have a flaky test case, turn it off. There's always somebody in the room who wants to argue about that. But what if this and what if that?
Yeah.
There's always a lot of finagling around that deceptively simple statement.
Yeah. What's your opinion, Melissa, of these three things? What's the easiest thing to design in? Do you have an opinion about that? Is there one that you say this is something that I just don't understand why you're not focusing on right now?
So I
Anything
would
jump out at
say
you or?
the easiest one is probably importance because everybody understands that, everybody, it's pretty common knowledge that smoke tests are a thing, and
Mhm.
probably you should have them. So I would say that's usually a pretty simple sell of I'm going to pull 5 or 10 of my integration tests out. These are going to be smoke tests, or I'm going to make a simple suite that just checks my, Docker health checks. That's a smoke
Yeah.
test. They're pretty high impact, right? Because I don't know how many times when we first turned on the smoke suite, but before we turned on the smoke suite, there were people who said, "Oh, something's funky with my test environment. I'm missing, blah, blah, blah," and it turns out, oh, a service didn't start. People would waste, tens to twenties to hundreds of minutes investigating something that a very simple check would have said, "Yeah, your service just not running."
Yeah.
Of course, you
Yeah.
can't log. The login service isn't running.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, we also as testers, it's ingrained in our heads that we can't test everywhere, we can't test everything, right? We can't exhaustively test. We can exhaustion test, which means test until I drop over, but we can't exhaustively test, so we have to prioritize, we have to think about what's most important. So I would agree with you. That's probably the one that is, most people, it's just more ingrained
Yeah.
in their thought process. So yeah.
I would say the most important thing that people aren't doing is worrying about their reliability. Because
Yeah.
that's the secret killer. It kills the relationship between dev and test. It kills people's relationship with automation in general.
Hmm.
And it won't necessarily bite you today, but it will bite you in the future.
Yep, and it
Bite you
kills your relationship with your customers too.
with your customers. It's a relationship killer. So it's not, as it doesn't necessarily have the same impact of, whoops, I shipped a service that doesn't start. But it's a slower, it can be more significant degradation in your trust
It
across the
can.
whole organization, everybody in the organization.
Yep, awesome. So before we jump into questions, just a couple things. I hope you all are considering attending the Agile Plus DevOps conference coming up. It's virtual this year. Obviously, it's usually in Vegas in early June. No, we're not going to Vegas. Nobody's going to Vegas. But we are holding it virtually. We've got 8 or 9 concurrent sessions going at once. There are different levels. There's a free version to give you access to keynotes and the technical presentations done by sponsors. There's a conference one package that lets you get access and on-demand access going forward to all the talks in the conference at the sessions. And then there's an all-purpose pass that gives you access to all the tutorials and stuff like that. Definitely check it out. As mentioned, it's totally awesome. Yeah, we just finished up Star, right? You were at Star, the virtual Star, right, Melissa? I think it went really great, and definitely was different being virtual, but I think it went really well. There's some workshops and summits here as well that you should consider, opportunities to learn more about leadership, learn more about integrating security, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's some new offerings from Coveros around different approaches to learning, integrating together classes, integrating together coaching into training, and some other exciting things we've been doing that people should check out. I mentioned earlier the hub. So the TechWell Hub is a Slack-based community, has over 5,000 people, and it's only been around for about 18 months. So it's growing really fast. People are on there every day talking about a variety of subjects. I'm going to be on here, and if Melissa has time, she will as well. We'll be in the DevOps channel after this in case anybody wants to pop in and ask any questions that we don't get to in the remaining time. It is free as well, so check it out. Go to hub.techwell.com if you want to join up. It's pretty cool. And then the last thing before we take questions is our next webinar. Very topical. So Johanna Rothman and Mark Kilby wrote a book recently on making distributed agile teams successful. Man, did they time that pretty good, huh? Obviously a hot topic. Anything distributed or virtual is a hot topic right now. And they're going to join me on August 6th to talk about how you move from, as they call it, chaos to success when putting up and standing up and running distributed agile teams. So please definitely check that out. And with that, we thank everybody for coming. Let's take some questions. Yeah, so Darian asks, so what's a good example of a well-designed smoke suite? You want to take that, Melissa? What's your thought on that?
Yeah. So a well-designed smoke suite should be as fast as possible and do nothing more than tell you that your P0 functionality exists. And for our service-based architecture, it's my service is alive in response to health checks. It's very tempting to do just a little more. That one in particular needs to stay very heavily scoped down because it needs to be bulletproof reliable, right? It needs to just tell you service can be tested, thing can be tested or thing cannot, right? Application starts and doesn't immediately crash desktop. Service starts, doesn't immediately create or down into the Docker pool.
Yeah, I always characterize it as, and you mentioned it in your discussion about simplicity and specificity is, I just want to know whether I should do more and it's worth my time to do more. So exactly. You're scoping it down to, can I quickly determine whether I can do more testing and it'll be productive or not? And that's the way you got to kind of think about a smoke suite, right?
Exactly. Because smoke suite, for those who don't know, comes from hardware testing land, and it was, if I plug this piece of hardware into the power, does smoke come out? Does it catch fire, or can I, do something with it?
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty. That's awesome. I've never done any real smoke. Well, I haven't on purpose ever done any smoke testing. I think I've smoke tested my toaster a couple times, but that wasn't on purpose, right?
Technically, you smoke test an appliance every time you turn it on, every time you plug it in.
That's because but I generated smoke.
Smoke gonna come out. It's good for more testing. It's good for use.
Yeah. Next question is from Chankrala. Did I get that right, Chankrala? For big data testing, what recommendations for smoke tests? Have you dealt with big data? Any thoughts there?
I would say it's about the same. It depends. So a lot of big data uses, makes heavy use of cloud resources. So I know for our big data pipeline, for example, it's small Python scripts interspersed with go shove this data into Redshift, go shove this data into something, clean this data up. Okay, shove this data into Looker. So I would look at smoke testing that sort of the same way, right? Can my Python scripts, can they access Looker? Great. Right, look at accessibility. Accessibility may be slightly different than, when it's all services you own versus services that, some are cloud services. There's still things that can go wrong, right? You can still have bad routing. That means wherever container you're running your Python in can't hit the cloud resource. So I would look at it the same way, right? Making sure that everything can talk to each other at bare minimum, right? The pieces can all speak together into a cohesive pipeline.
Yep. No, I think that's a good way to put it. Allison says, what are ways to help QA facilitate collaboration with devs on what unit tests exist and factoring that into what is done, not done for testing manually?
Yeah, I like to work with data because there's not it's not a discussion. It's just here's the data. So I find the easiest way for that is to provide code coverage report from the unit tests, and so then you don't have to ask the
Mhm.
dev what their opinion on is what they covered. They can just tell you this is what's covered. There's no opinion. It is what was covered, and you can see precisely what branches were covered, what weren't, and then can craft a test plan to hit the gaps.
And the test results along with that too, right? To your
Yeah, of
point, we
course.
actually had a customer who
Of course.
we had a customer who was so focused on code coverage, and they actually were giving awards for getting your coverage higher, that the team that won, actually a bunch of their tests just didn't pass. It kind of
Yeah,
sort of missed the
implicit in everything I
entire
say, the
point, you know?
test pass. The devs should
Yeah. Oh
never
yeah,
give
I
anything code
forgot
that they're gonna
that.
just pass on. Like that's your priority zero. Never receive code that has failing tests on it because you know it has to be changed. Like why would you look at that? It's such a
Yeah,
waste.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, so Srikanth asks, can you explain what are some best practices for automation when integrating security into the process?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this.
We did.
It sort of depends on how you're integrating security into your process and what kind of checks, how reliable they are. If they're returning recommendations, or they're returning, some suites do a lot of recommendations or flag things as areas of interest, and some are more, binary, yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we've integrated security at a number of different levels, right? We do security pass as a part of static analysis, and the static analysis is pretty reliable. Whoops, whoops, you didn't sanitize your input. Yes, it's true. You did sanitize your input, right? It's not really an opinion. Um, so we do static analysis to catch really the lowest hanging fruit. We have a much more in-depth automated pass that takes a long time and doesn't all sometimes requires human interpretation. So that runs, as I think we talked about before, runs after everything else is run,
Mm-hmm.
and only runs selectively. We have, sometimes we automatically flag certain areas of code as of security interest,
Mm-hmm.
and then a security reviewer, a security expert can say, yeah, you need to run the in-depth pass on this before I'll approve the change.
Sure. One thing we do that's very for testers to get going on security testing, and we have a 2-day security testing class that we give that talks about some of this stuff, is some of the dynamic security testing tools out there, depending upon the environment you're in the application, can run as proxies. So they'll sit between your client and your server, whether that's web or mobile or whatever it is, and it'll just watch traffic and look for things you're doing or passing that are not being done securely. And you can actually run them as a side effect as you're doing the rest of your testing. Whether that's, functional testing that's being done manually, is being done as part of a suite that you put together and are running as part of your CI/CD process. And it gives you, as a side effect, some security information. It's an easy, quick way to get going for testers that don't know a lot about security, to start to learn and see security types of things and get smarter on security. And then once you get past that, you can start being more aggressive and kind of attacking, right? And doing some things that are more devious. But you'd be surprised how much low hanging fruit you can glean from using a proxy that's watching what you're testing and what's being passed around. Have you seen that, Melissa? You all use it, any of those
I
tools,
haven't
or
seen it.
familiar with those?
I have some familiarity with it.
Yeah, they're
Sort
cool.
of
They work pretty well, and like I said, it's a nice way to get going if you don't know anything about security, and they fit right into your testing environment, so it's pretty easy to set up yourself. Right, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, you mentioned, Melissa, one of the challenges with something like source code, SaaS tools, right, that analyze source code is, well, you need access to the source, right? And if you're in a test group, you may or may not have access to source in the build environment, right? And so these kinds of tools that are proxies will let you get going without having to get access to source code and things that you might not have access, in your particular situation.
Exactly.
So Allison asks, regarding UI automation, do you have thoughts on BDD / end-to-end style tests versus a meta automation approach, test literally just one thing in each test?
Mm, so I think BDD is fine. I don't have a lot of great experiences with it personally, which may or may not have anything to do with actual BDD versus however we tried to implement BDD. I think you have to be careful with end-to-end style testing because they can get really big. So I think as long as your end-to-end style tests are right are fast, are reliable, and can be sorted, can be broken up a little, right? If your end-to-end tests really are what we talked about earlier, I create a user, I log into the user, I browse to my shopping page, like that's too much. And I get that that's sort of like a user story, but that's too much of a user story. That user story is too big. It's too big to be tested efficiently. I suspect it's actually 3 user stories strung together.
Yeah, so back to specificity there. Yeah, and I would agree with you. I mean, one of the things I find that oftentimes the term BDD is so overloaded, people don't really understand because you don't see the word test in there anywhere, right? Because, it's not about just testing, right? BDD as we define it, use it, describe it, is just all about everybody understanding what the requirement means, whether we call that a user story or whatever we call it a feature. It's getting dev, test, and the business all on the same page about what this thing is that we're going to try to implement and test. And then we, right? And then we go and we build it and test it together. Now, there are tools that will support that process, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people say, well, BDD equals Cucumber or SpecFlow or whatever. Those are all enablers for testing, the things that maybe you thought through in terms of your requirements and what they mean, and maybe up front you decided to, lead with a test, right? Kind of a test first approach. But BDD isn't just the, here's how I'm automating or what I'm automating. It's getting everybody on the same page about what something's all about, which we have to do irrespective of whether we're doing automation or not, right, Melissa?
Yeah,
isn't that fundamentally something we have to do in development to be successful?
It's huge, right? There's really 2 types of testing. There's testing that something is functionally correct, and there's testing that the thing met the requirements. 2 totally different types of testing with very different goals.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Aaron asked, what's your favorite test management tool for Agile?
I don't have one.
Yeah, I don't.
We don't have a lot of manual test cases that need a test management tool.
Yeah. Now, I mean, some people put their automation suite in a test management tool, and there's a lot of tools out there, right, that you can use to do test management if that's something that you need. And the place we do see test management tools get used, and I think get used well, is markets where there's regulatory and other compliance things, and traceability of information is critical, right?
Yep.
And so it is market dependent. We personally, we like Inflectra's tool. We like, Zephyr and some of those types of tools, that they all integrate well into things like Jira and whatnot. There's a lot of tools out there. I don't like to start with tools. I always like to start with, let's come up with a good testing process and a good approach. And then let's figure out, well, one is what tools do we already have, right? Because it's a lot easier to get people to adopt tools they already use. Even if they use them wrong, we can fix that. But if we're going to introduce something brand new, well, then you have to overcome that whole barrier.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, what's to integrate with whatever the rest of your pipeline is. We've explored using, we don't use Jira, we use Target Process to manage, and Target Process actually has a very good test management tool built in, but haven't been using it. But if we were to use one, that would probably be the one we would use because it's the most closely integrated with everything else that we're doing.
You've already got it, and and it's just so much easier if it's something you already have. And there's examples of tools you have that just don't fit or don't work or whatever. They were purchased and they're the wrong thing or whatnot. But in general, if you've already got something, you should give it a shot because you've already invested in it. Somebody probably knows it. Somebody probably likes it. That's where you should start, obviously. Thing rolling. Appreciate everybody coming, and don't forget about the next webinar, as I mentioned. That's going to be on August 6th. I think it's going to be a great one as well. I want to thank you, Melissa, for joining us here today. I think it was a fantastic discussion, and I appreciate your thoughts about lessons learned designing tests for CI/CD.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jeff. So happy to be here.
Yeah, well, have a great day, everyone, and we'll talk again next time.
See you at Agile DevOps.
Yeah, see you at Agile DevOps.